like to welcome you to the continuation of your news and current affairs program, reaching you live from our Lagos Network studios on the ITV network. I am Joshua Bokata. As the 2027 general election draws closer, there has been several events unfolding, from political defections of one political party to the other across the length and breadth of Nigeria, to coalition attempts, and of course the most recent, which is the implementation of the Electoral Reform Report put together by the legal luminary himself in the person of late Mohammed Wise, which brings us to the program that we'll be looking at, the discourse that we'll be looking at on the program this morning, which is the call by the chairman of the Labour Party National Caretaker Committee in the person of Senator Nenade Usman, who has called on the federal government in a way of immortalizing such legal icon by implementing the Electoral Reform Report put together by him, especially during the time the then president of Nigeria in the person of Musa Yar'Adua was in office, which of course, due to his ill health and of course his untimely death, couldn't realize that particular implementation of the report. And right now, the issue already is on the front burner. Now the question is, does this current government have that political power, as it were, to be able to implement that report? What exactly is contained in the electoral report put together by the legal luminary in the person of Mohammed Wise? And don't forget, once upon a time, there was a president of the country in the person of President Muhammadu Buhari, who, despite repeated calls by Nigerians and of course the legislature at the time, putting up such recommendation before him to assent, he has refused repeatedly to assent it, not until when he was leaving office. Is history about to repeat itself again? I leave you to answer that question, but of course, for the sake of our conversation this morning, I am being joined by two gentlemen who will be providing us with insightful analysis as regards this issue. I'm being joined right here in the person of Barrister Jide Ologun, who is a legal practitioner and of course a public affairs analyst. Good morning, Barrister, and thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you too. It's my pleasure to be here.
All right, I'm also being joined virtually from Ogun State in the person of Mr. Yemi Ajayi, who is into policy management and of course a security expert. Good morning, Mr. Yemi, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right, now let's get into the conversation proper, but I'm going to start with you, Barrister Jide. Yes, before we look into the content of the Electoral Reform Report put together by the late Justice Mohammed Wise, do you think that the consideration of this particular report is coming somewhat too early, as some would say, given the fact that we're just 2 years, as it were, away from the general election? What's your thought on that?
You cannot say it's too early. Let's start by clarifying what reform means. Reform means you had a formation that has not delivered maximum value, so you are reforming it for better performance, and that should even be constantly engaged in the process of a project. And having laid that foundation, let me also take us back in history. The Mohammed Wise report we are talking about was put together and delivered to the government in year 2008 as a result of the 2007 elections that was considered the worst ever in Nigeria. And the outcome, one of the outcomes of considering that report, is the Electoral Act of 2010. You see, even though not all the recommendations have been given oxygen by the government, and the intention of the report we encapsulated: number one, to enhance participation by voters. Recently the National Assembly came up with a bill to make it compulsory for eligible voters to vote, adults in the country, and that bill has been pulled back. Number 2, to reduce electoral malpractices. And number 3, to facilitate a transparent election that meets the global standard of having free, fair, credible, and transparent elections. And beyond the reforms, I think we should be concerned also with the handlers of electoral processes in Nigeria, because I recall that 1993 predates the 2008 report of Honorable Justice who is retired and now late, and permit me to express my condolences to the family and to Nigeria as a whole of that great statesman whom we celebrate so much. So in 1993, Hope 93, we had the option A4 election in Nigeria conducted by Professor Humphrey Nwosu, which is adjudged the best election ever in Nigeria. But somewhere along the line, the government of IBB, Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, as the military head of state, truncated that election. So it's really about the handlers, because again in year 2022 we had an amendment to the Electoral Act, which we're even still debating, because again, given some judicial decisions, INEC is not mandated to even implement some of the fresh conditions introduced to make elections more credible in Nigeria, when you talk about the IREV transmission and things like that. So it's we still have a long way to go, but by and large, I think I will submit that it has to do more with the handlers of the process and how to make it mandatory for them to comply. And if the laws are not specific, then why don't you go back to the National Assembly and make it specific so that there can be consequences for all these malpractices?
So while we'll be looking at the handlers, which in your submission has more of the issue, rather than looking at the frequency at which we tend to enhance the Electoral Act. Now let me fall back to my guest who is is joining us virtually. Mr. Femi, looking at the issue, you are into policy management. What does it take to put up a policy, especially such kind of policy that will ensure and guarantee the conduct of a free, fair, and credible election, given the fact that, as our guest has said, it is not coming too early, because for every cycle of election there should be a reform to be able to enhance, either when it comes to voter participation or the process itself. So what does it take, looking at it from your expertise as a policy formation expert? We can barely hear you, Mr. Femi. I don't know what's wrong, maybe from your end?
Hear me now? I think
yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
End, so
go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me. And I also want to say, Barrister Jidologo, nice having you on this conversation. Justice, I think there's an interference somewhere, but let me
go ahead.
Continue.
We can hear you. Go ahead. We can hear you.
The policies were very clear, as recommended by Justice Uwe's committee. There was need for policies to be around what INEC should do. First, stripping off political influences on INEC, according to the recommendation then. And of course, some of the recommendations that were made that should be a policy matter by now is about the selection of the INEC chairman, as well as the funding of INEC. The selection of INEC chairman is expected to rest with the National Judicial Council, and the funding should also be, independent. But unfortunately, that has not been considered. Even within the Police Service Commission's guideline, in terms of code of conduct, the roles of the police should be very, very clear. in all this, but it was not made available, as a matter of policy. We also have a situation where you need to address petitions against, you know, people, maybe probably when they have won election and all that. In fact, specifically, Justice Wise said that once there is a case against you, that case should be settled before you are even being inaugurated, either as a governor or senator or whatever. These are policy matters that were specifically spelled out. And of course, there are different other dimensions to it, but one that is quite very clear in the recent uh, political landscape in Nigeria has to do with the electronic transmission of electoral results, which we strongly believe is well not stated. Reason, for example, INEC has the discretion to determine the transmission of electoral results. That makes it extremely subjective. Policies should have certain level of subjectivity, very, very minimal. If policies have so much huge subjectivity, it takes it to the point where implementation becomes difficult. It becomes discretionary. It gives power to an individual. And we have seen that in the 2023 election, where the IRF was even, the beavers, they were just kept on one side, and the INEC chairman went ahead to apply his discretion. He acted within the law, but that law needs to be repealed, it needs to be addressed. So from the policy angle, there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of gaps that we ought to fill. And we're in 2027. 2027 is just here. 2027 is about 15 months or 20 months from now. And we keep asking ourselves question, what do we have ahead? If we are serious as a nation, this is the time to really fix those gaps we have identified in the past. And we should be able to do so many things in terms of policy, roll it out, and make it implementable. Thank you.
All right. Although you delved into the next question that I would have wanted us to discuss together when it comes to the content of the policy itself, but I wanted you to touch a little bit on your last submission where you said when a policy is made to be subjective, it allows an individual or a group, as it were, to be able to manipulate the process. What do you think could be done at that point, especially considering your expertise when it comes to policy management? That's where I wanted you to address.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of policy management, one thing that we should know is stakeholders management is very important. But we are in a nation where stakeholder management is a very difficult and tall order. Is very difficult and tall order in the sense that it makes life, an average Nigerian don't like to live within the ambit of policy. Okay, so these policies may face certain level of delays because of selfish interest. So we have quite a lot to do, but again, there is politics in policy formulation and there is policy formulation in politics. So we need to be able to balance both. Thank you.
All right. Now, let me fall back to you, Barrister Jide. He has mentioned the fact that in a country like ours, it's so difficult for people to confine themselves to certain policies, especially when it doesn't suit them. Now, from a legal perspective, let's delve into the crux of the matter, which is the content of that electoral reform itself. We have seen in recent past where it's almost impossible to separate the executive arm from the electoral body itself, which is INEC. We've seen cases where recommendation, especially who becomes the chairman of the electoral umpire itself, the committee set up, and its funding have been largely influenced by the executive. This time around, by the office of the president, before it is passed to the legislature for screening and approval. How legally, what kind of legal framework can we have to be able to separate completely the influence of the executive into the electoral body itself, so that we begin to see a total departure, as it were, and always achieving a situation where INEC can be able to operate freely and independently, as the name implies?
Interestingly, that was one of the key recommendations in the Uwe's report, that there should be public appointment of the principal officers of INEC to give INEC that independence. But here we are, it's not been implemented. So it's legal. The appointment process we have now is legal until it is amended, because you also need to amend the constitution. And let me say this, if you look at the Electoral Act amendment of 2022, it introduced a new feature into the process that political appointees who intend to actively get involved at the primaries must resign. It was debated, but because it's been introduced into the law, the likes of Amechi and some of them had to resign from office to go and contest. You see, so, but if you don't have it clearly stated, then what do you do about it? Is the political power there? Yes, it is there. And please, I'm not holding brief for the executive. We talk so much about the executive. If the executive is given the power to interfere or intervene, the power will be exercised. I mean, just like we debated the proclamation of emergency rule on Rivers State, the Constitution gives the president the power. The extent to which he will exercise the power is subject to judicial interpretations. You see, so, but I think where we need help is for the National Assembly to be awake to their responsibilities. Section 4 of the Nigerian Constitution 1999 as amended says that the National Assembly shall have powers to make laws for the peace, orderliness, and good government in Nigeria. They can amend the Constitution. I mentioned one here today. One of them proposed a bill that it should make voting compulsory, as it is done in Australia and Egypt and some other countries of the world, over 20 countries. And they did not consider what is in place in those countries that is making them succeed with that. You see, so, and these are the issues. The National Assembly should sit up, look at these reforms, look at what can be introduced. And interestingly, when you have the pronouncement of the judiciary on some issues, it becomes law. We have common law and things like that. But in Nigeria, these are not respected. And now we have problems in a situation where on the same matter you have conflicting decisions from different courts of coordinated jurisdiction. Now we are talking about electoral reforms. How do we interpret the issue of the members of the House of Assembly in Rivers State that defected, and at the end of the day, even the highest court in the land, in a way, endorsed that defection despite the provisions of the Constitution, that if you defect without major crisis in your party from top to bottom, you stand to lose your seat, even though it's a peculiar case. So these are issues. So the National Assembly are there to make laws for the peace, orderliness, and good government in Nigeria. And they should be looking at areas where reforms are needed, policies that should be concretized. I have argued and argued and argued. Now, the decision of the court is that the IREV is just a transmission, just for monitoring. You know, it's not a collation device. And now, if the lawmakers have seen that gap, they can go ahead and amend it and specify the expectations. Otherwise, INEC will begin to hide under the discretion given to them by coming up with guidelines, and you may not be able to hold them accountable to these guidelines. Okay. So there should be sincerity of purpose, whether you are talking of the executive, the legislative arm, or the judiciary. And again, the major concern should be politics itself in Nigeria has become a high yield environment where the active politicians are constantly busy on how to subvert and suppress the laws and manipulate and everything. I brought out an issue that many may not have noticed. Because of defection, crises have been created in some parties. Serious crisis, deliberately by these politicians.
Okay, so
to justify their defection.
All right, so
and you can see how they are defecting massively.
Okay, so you've made your point, especially as regards the withdrawal of certain laws, that has emboldened the executive arm of government to influence decision making when it comes to recommendation. Now, let me fall back to you, Mr. Femi. You are a security expert, and I believe that you understand what it means, especially looking at section 60 that states that final results from polling units should not just only be electronically transmitted, but also uploaded to National Electronic Board where all can see. This, I believe, is in a bid to reduce much of human error and interference. So, as a security expert that you are, how can this be achieved?
Okay, thank you, Joshua. My name is Adeyemi. You've called me Femi.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay. So, you see, one thing that we know, there is physical security, there is IT security. Now, what we're talking about here is more of, IT security. Nigeria is not ready for this, and I must be very sincere with you. We are not ready because of political fraud that, it's been birthed, but political fraud that is being advanced, political fraud that is being believed in, political fraud that is almost becoming a national culture. And I'm saying that with my full chest. What does it cost us to say that we have a system where anybody can vote from anywhere? And it can, I'm so disappointed that we have a system where we've noted the gap and we are not filling it. There's nothing wrong with having a system where I go into the polling booth, I vote. After voting, I voted, then, it collates it. After collating it, it passed through a security system in microseconds, and my vote is counting. I'm looking at it at the dashboard. I'm seeing how the votes are increasing, which candidate is increasing, which candidate is not. But guess what? Why I said we are not ready is because if such system happens with foolproof security, I bet you one of the things they'll come up with eventually is that the system has error. They will deliberately say the system was hacked. They will deliberately come up. You see, we are people that whenever we want to get anything, we don't mind whatever happens to anything or anybody. We just want to get it done and move on. And of course, that is what has been keeping us where we are. Another thing that we also talk about in terms of IT security in Nigeria is that IT security in Nigeria is advancing, but we are not there yet.
Okay.
We are not there. If people can have their money in banks and one person can wake up from his bedroom and pull out their money, and you may complain and nobody is helping you, how much more electoral, votes?
All right.
Along the passage, one can
we are pressed for time. We are pressed for time, Mr. Yemi Ajayi. We're pressed for time. We've taken that point of yours where you said we are not ready because of the fact that we have made political fraud become a norm. Now, let me quickly fall back to my guest here, Barrister Jide, to give us his last take, especially with regards to the report that the late judicial icon said about issue that has to do with no elective person should assume office until the case against him or her in the tribunal is disposed of. We have seen cases where, especially in Edo State, where a case at the tribunal is still on, but the governor, as it were, has hit the ground running. So what do you say as regards this?
You see, in consultancy, recommendations are recommendations. You cannot compel your client to implement. So if that recommendation is valued by the stakeholders that should implement, then push it back to the National Assembly. I've said it, that now amend our laws to reflect this, and it becomes the new norm. But if you ignore it, the status quo continues. So I believe that it appears that the politicians still have enormous powers to influence the direction of the law, the policies, and everything. And that is a discussion for another day. But let me say this. You cannot be embarking on a journey the old ways and expect new results. And the Chinese have a saying that the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is now.
I think that's a beautiful place to leave the conversation. Mr. Yemi Ajayi, can you just give us your take, your final take, before we wrap up the program this morning?
You see, what I would say ahead is 2027, like some people said, is decided. It's decided because of the scheme and machination of human. But one thing I know very sure, nobody is more intelligent than God. No matter what anybody plans, no matter what anybody does, one thing I know, God rules in the affairs of men. He will choose the next president. If it's the current president, he will choose him. If it's the next president, God will choose. But one thing I know very clearly, no manipulation will work and succeed.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you so much. Well, the question is God still interested in the affairs of men? Well, that's for our audience to decide. But of course, just as our guest, has said, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the best next time is now. What are we going to do with our future if we don't plan now? Especially looking at it that the 2027 election is just around the corner. Well, that's our offering this morning for you. Thank you so much for watching. And of course, the program continues as we'll be handing you over now to our Bini Network for the rest of the program.